no further ado, Dr. Larry Schweikart.
Many people would say, well, why do we need another biography of Ronald Reagan? And the answer is the guy who had the chance to do it right the first time, Edmund Morris, totally screwed it up. He created a fictional character of himself that he put into the book, which means you can't really rely on anything he said because you don't know if it's real or not. The other problem with Morris, who should have been the best biographer ever, was that he kept looking for the real Ronald Reagan. Who's the real Ronald Reagan? Well, I got news for you. The real Ronald Reagan was the guy you saw on TV delivering those speeches. The real Ronald Reagan was the guy you saw at the campaign rallies. There was no hidden secret Reagan inside looking for these deep inner feelings or whatnot. He's very much a guy of my father's generation who was busy doing stuff and creating stuff and didn't have time to sit there contemplating his navel. And so Ronald Reagan is very much the guy that you see. We do see him. There he is. I began a lot of this work in 2010 when I was working on 7 Events that Made America. And that's when I found that, there really is a tremendous amount to Reagan's story that hasn't been told because so much of the archives either had not been declassified at the time or nobody had looked at it. Reagan's last 2 biographers didn't really spend any time in the archives at all. So I spent a great deal of time there from 2010 until about 2016 in the Reagan papers and the Reagan archives. Paul, I seem to have slashed myself getting up here. Could I get a napkin from someone? Bleeding all over myself. Speaking of bleeding, if you scratched Reagan, you'd get red, white, and blue. And this is the real Ronald Reagan. So Reagan, as a young man, most of you know this, but he was a lifeguard on the Rock River in Illinois. And he saved 77 people from drowning. Now, if he had done nothing else in his entire life, he would have gone down as a hero for saving 77 people from drowning. And he used to make a little notch on a piece of wood nearby every time he would save somebody. And some liberal historians say, well, they didn't really need saving. Some of these people weren't really drowning. Well, yes, they were. Because I uncovered all of these news clippings that went back and interviewed these people. And one guy said, yeah, I was caught under a piece of wood, or I was taken under the toe, and he definitely saved my life. So Reagan ends up going to Eureka College, a small Christian college there in Illinois. And they have a nice little Reagan library there at Eureka, by the way. He isn't the best student. He's kind of a mediocre student. Years later, Reagan will come back to Eureka and will receive an honorary degree. And he said, well, I always thought the first one I got was honorary. He really wants to be a football player. But he has a problem. He can't see. He's nearly blind. And back then they didn't have football players wearing glasses, and I don't think he got contact lenses until about 1946. So finally the coach decides, okay, I can put him in the line where he can at least block the big shape in front of him. And he did all right at that. While he's at Eureka, though, he becomes our only American president to ever lead a student protest. The situation was that the president of Eureka had to cut costs. They had severe budget issues in the Great Depression. And he was going to eliminate all of these classes for seniors. The seniors needed to have to graduate. At the same time, he also cut a student dance. Now this is really weird. Because you see, Eureka's a Christian college, they didn't permit dancing. But they had a sanctioned college dance called the Grind. And in the Grind, the boys would stand in a circle facing inward, and the girls would stand inside facing outward. When the music started, they would dance in different directions, and they would do a little twerking or whatever. and then the music, the needle would be lifted on the phonograph, and you were to talk to the boy or girl in front of you, which was how they got the students to know each other, right? So this guy not only gets rid of these senior classes, he bans the grunt, and that was too much. So 11 o'clock at night, the seniors go out and they ring the bell, and all the students come out, and no small number of adults come out, and they say, we're not going to stand for this, we've got to protest this, we're going to go out on strike. But we seniors can't lead the strike because it would look too self-serving. We need a freshman. And Reagan had this reputation already, being in the drama club, of being a pretty good speaker. So he's drafted to lead this student protest, a strike. Problem was, this was on a Friday night, and they were just breaking for Thanksgiving for a full week. So they weren't going to get to the actual strike until a week from Monday, which is a long time to maintain, fervor and emotion and so forth. Nevertheless, Reagan succeeds. He gives a couple of speeches to these guys. He talks to all the students. On Monday, when they come back, out of all the students, only 6 vote not to strike, and 2 are those of the president's daughters. So he has a very successful career as a student protest leader. Again, he loves playing football, and this will later come in handy in his acting career, right? As an actor, the way Reagan gets to be an actor is he is a radio announcer for the Chicago Cubs in Iowa. I don't know if you're familiar with Iowa, but the Chicago Cubs play in Chicago. And so Reagan would have to do the games by getting a ticker tape, and he would read the plays, and then he would act it out like he was watching it live. And this was all fine and dandy till that one fateful time that the ticker tape died momentarily, and Reagan has nothing to read, so he starts to make up the game. And he's stalling. And he says, it's a long fly ball. Oh, this is really, really, really long. Okay. Oh, the pitcher shakes off the sign. Oh, he shakes off. Oh, he steps off the mound. And he's going on 7 minutes he did this. Until finally the ticker tape starts up again. And the guy flied out on the first pitch. So I'm not sure what he did with that one. But he's with the Cubs in California in spring training. A friend of his from Dixon, Illinois, a girlfriend, had gone out to California and already made something of a name for herself in acting and entertainment. And she got Reagan hooked up with an agent when he was out in California. And the agent got him 2 quick screen tests. One of them was with Warner Brothers. He has to go back to Iowa to go back to his radio gig. When he gets off the train, there's a telegram waiting for him, and it's from his agent. And he says, Warner Brothers wants to sign you at X number of dollars for Y number of years. I forget the exact number. And Reagan sends a telegram back, sign quick before they change their minds, right? So he becomes an actor. Dirty little secret about Reagan the actor. He wasn't a good actor because he didn't want to be a good actor. Reagan did not work at his craft the way other actors do. Think of somebody like Heath Ledger, who basically killed himself to be the Joker in the Batman movie, or Christian Bale, who will lose 40 or 50 pounds, or Matthew McConaughey will put on 50 pounds, or Gary Oldman, who just looked just like Churchill. Reagan didn't do that. Part of the reason was Reagan could not really see himself playing a bad guy. He would himself say, you know that guy who runs in, grabs the payphone and says, hold the presses, have I got a scoop for you? That's me, right? And so he doesn't see himself playing a bad guy. He doesn't do method acting. He doesn't throw himself into it, with a couple of exceptions. One of those was, of course, George Gibb, when he plays George Gibb in Newt Rockne All-American, and he can get into this role. He's a football player. He gets it. The other one, of course, was King's Row, where he plays Drake McHugh, a wealthy playboy who loses all of his money. McHugh is in love with the daughter of a doctor who hates him. And when McHugh is working out in the railroad yards, 2 cars come together, crush his legs, and he is taken, of all places, to this doctor who amputates his legs instead of fixing him. And when Reagan, Drake McHugh, wakes up, he has the famous scene where he says, where's the rest of me? And people thought that he really should have been nominated for an Academy Award for that role, but Spencer Tracy got the backing of Warner Brothers, and back then a studio would only back one person from their studio at a time. And by the way, he shot that scene on the first take. He got that on the first take. While he was in the studios and acting, he became extremely political, and to the point that fellow actors didn't even want to sit with him at lunch, because he'd only want to talk about politics and economics and stuff, and they want to talk about who's sleeping with whom and who got what role, you know. And so they would kind of run away from Reagan. And this really affects his first marriage to Jane Wyman. He's just too political for her. She's interested in movies and a movie career, and he's interested in politics. She does nominate him to be on the SAG board, Screen Actors Guild board, and before too long, he's named their president. So he's our only American president who has ever been the president of a union. And by the way, we only have two presidents who were ever real union members: Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump, who also holds a Screen Actors Guild card for The Apprentice. So Reagan is very concerned with the number of communists he finds in the unions, and they have knockdown, drag-out battles in these meetings. He is summoned to D.C., to HUAC, the House Un-American Affairs Committee, to give testimony, and the guys on HUAC think he's really going to blast the movie studios. Boy, he's going to let them have it. And he delivers a very measured testimony in which he says, yes, there were communists there. I think we've gotten rid of most of them. And then he launches into an incredible part of his testimony where he says, I would never want to see censorship in this country, and I would never want to see our First Amendment rights in any way violated. And then, horror of horrors, he quotes Thomas Jefferson to congressmen. I mean, that's like showing Dracula the cross, right? Jefferson, no, I can't have that. In the 1950s, his movie career sags badly, and he accepts a job in television. This was not done very often by movie stars, because television was thought to be a real step down. But Reagan realized that TV was the coming medium, and so he takes a job with General Electric on General Electric Theater, and he has two jobs to do. One, every week he would host GE Theater, and perhaps every 2 or 3, 4 weeks he would appear on an episode of GE Theater, which drew in the very best actors and actresses, because GE Theater would allow them to play against type. They could pick their own roles, so people who were always heroes in the movie could come in and play a villain, for example. Anyway, the second part of his job with GE was to go around to the General Electric factory shop floors and deliver inspirational talks and talk with the factory workers. And so he visits everyday Americans all the time. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these speeches, which is where he hones the 3x5 cards. He develops that during these GE speeches. And he learns to just give a few lines, talk about a few national issues, and then ask questions. They're asked if there's any questions, because people always had questions of Reagan. In one case, he's giving a speech to an all-female workforce. And this is his words, not mine, so don't throw anything at me. He said, a bull of a woman came up and said, Buster, I'd like to back you into a corner. He said, well, it'd have to be a pretty big corner. So he gets to know ordinary Americans through these GE shop floor talks. In 1964, he's invited to give the famous Time for Choosing speech on behalf of the Goldwater campaign. And when he's done, all the Republican bigwigs are looking at each other going, we nominated the wrong guy, right? That won't be the last time they're going to say that. But it puts Reagan on a national scale. It exposes him to a national audience. And, well, let's not go to Jimmy yet. So he's elected governor in 1966. Now, another discovery I made. The major contributor to electing Ronald Reagan governor of California was his brother, Neil. Neil was an advertising executive who had extensive contacts with all sorts of business people in California and some of the richest people in California. And he organized all of them to get behind his brother's campaign. He did something else, though. Ron was afraid of flying at that time. And so Neil calls him up one day. Reagan's up in Northern California, and Moon, as Neil was called, says, do you want to be president? And Reagan said, well, yes. He said, okay, I've got a meeting at the Coconut Grove in Los Angeles tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock. And Reagan says, well, I'd have to fly. And Moon said, do you want to be president? And hung up. And sure enough, Reagan was at that meeting, and there was no indication after that he ever had a problem with flying. While governor, he deals with, interestingly, student protests. You know, how ironic is this? And he uses a variety of tactics with the students. Sometimes he's, strong arms them. Other times he disarms them with humor. One time, the students planned a major protest in Sacramento on the Capitol when Reagan was supposed to be out of town. Well, Reagan learned about this. It was going to be a silent protest. So Reagan turns his limo around, drives back in, arrives right in the middle of this silent protest, and he walks through all the silent protesters. And they all cracked up. They all start laughing, right? Another occasion, he's in Santa Barbara, which had real serious violence, where I went to school, and a student got shot and killed by a ricochet, actually, when the National Guard came in, and they burned the Bank of America building. You know, it was serious stuff. Reagan arrives in his limo, and a bearded kid, is up there beating on the limo. We are the future. We are the future. Reagan grabs his yellow pad and writes, I'll sell my bonds. By all accounts, he's a very successful governor. He has to compromise on a number of things that conservatives do not like. He signs, for example, the California abortion bill. He raises taxes. There's a number of things that conservatives don't like about the Reagan presidency. But overall, it's a governorship. But it's considered a great success. In 1976, he's being urged to run for the presidency. Now, this is tough because you're going to be running against an incumbent, sitting Republican president. Very hard to do. He had run in '68 kind of as a write-in candidate, hoping people would just push him in. He wasn't ready yet by his own admission. Even in '68, people thought Reagan was too old. In '76, they really think he's too old. His whole family opposes the race. But he comes within about 120 delegates of beating Ford. It's a very, very tight race. Of course, Ford goes on to lose to Jimmy Carter. In the book, Reagan, the American President, I have a chapter called The Worst President Ever, and there's an asterisk next to it, and at the bottom of the page it says, until Barack Obama. Jimmy Carter is a disaster in so many ways. It would take 2 or 3 hours to go through all of them. Energy policy, military policy, certainly economic policy was one of the worst. And he has a habit of just coming up with bad phrases. He calls one of his speeches, quote, the moral equivalent of war, which when you do the acronym is meow. It's hardly something that's going to raise people up to go fight against inflation. Then he gives his famous malaise speech, which of course he doesn't use the term malaise any more than Reagan ever used the term space, laser, or Star Wars in his Star Wars speech, right? It's called the crisis of confidence speech. But everybody had malaise after they heard it. I mean, it drove down everybody's spirits. And Reagan, who is this very uplifting sort of guy, a guy who is very optimistic, always sees the possibilities, doesn't have a great deal of trouble with Carter in the general election in 1980 until the very last 2 weeks. And in the last 2 weeks, Richard Worthland, his pollster, comes to him and he goes, Mr. Reagan, he says, you've fallen behind in the polls. I think we should take Carter's invitation to debate. Carter had had a standing invitation to Reagan to debate throughout the campaign because he was behind. So Reagan accepts the invitation to debate. It comes the latest of any debate in presidential history, just 10 days away from the election, the Saturday before the final weekend, which is really, really late. And in that debate, Reagan wins the presidency essentially with 5 words. Carter is haranguing him on his Medicare and his medical policies, and Reagan goes, well, there you go again. And that just, it made Carter look small and ineffective. It made Reagan look like kind of the grandfatherly figure who just was so wise and knew what was going on. Reagan comes into office with two major policy objectives: build up the American economy and defeat the Soviet Union. And yes, he did believe you could defeat the Soviet Union. He's asked what is his policy toward the Cold War, and he said it's simple. We win, they lose. And of course, this horrified Washingtonians who for 30 years had done nothing but mutual assured destruction, and oh, let's not upset anybody. And Reagan says, no, we're not going to upset them, we're going to beat them. So he saw the world holistically, that everything that made America better, in fact, he's the one who coins the term "Make America Great Again." Okay, everything that makes America better or greater simultaneously diminishes the Soviet Union, and so he, in his inflation battle, reappoints tall Paul Volcker, 6'7" of him, as the Fed chief, and he encourages Volcker to stamp out inflation. This is going to be pretty important later. Of course, he built up the military, but this is perhaps given too much weight given all of his strategic genius and how he defeats the Soviet Union compared to some other things. But I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that he authorizes construction of 100 B-1 bombers, the B-2 bomber, authorizes deployment of the cruise missiles, authorizes construction of 50 MX missiles, and then he lucks out. Like any great leader, he has a stroke of luck. The first Trident submarine, the USS Ohio, went into the water in March 1981 for its sea trials. Sea trials are where all of our anti-submarine warfare stuff tries to find our submarine. They couldn't find it. And the admirals are reporting, Mr. President, our sub is undetectable. We can't find it. Well, if we couldn't find it, the Soviets sure couldn't find it. And so later, it was kind of just good luck on my part, I guess, but my roommate up at my taught for a single year at the University of Wisconsin, Richland Center. Anybody from Wisconsin? Okay, it's a little teeny campus, 200 students total. It is so small, folks, they made me the assistant men's basketball coach. I have been an NCAA men's basketball coach. I didn't get a big contract either. Maybe that's because we went 5-14. But anyway, my roommate had just finished serving on boomer submarines. And he validated everything that I thought I knew about this. And he said, yeah, he said, we could have parked one of our subs in the Baltic right in one of their harbors and they couldn't find it. But our guys were so good on our sonar units, they could pick up Soviet ships leaving harbor in the Baltic from America. The really good sonar guys could tell you what type of ship it is. Oh, that's a freighter. Oh, that's a cruiser. And the really, really good guys could tell you the name of the vessel. That's the USSR Lenin, right? That's how good we were. So Reagan has this holistic approach to defeating the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviets export four things: vodka, gold, oil, and spies. And so he wasn't going to do anything about vodka. You know, let them have their vodka. But he immediately launches this program to undercut what the Soviets export. So I talked about tall Paul Volcker a minute ago. Volcker drives inflation down from over 8% in Carter's time to 0 in 1 quarter in 1982. Absolutely astounding. But more important, what does this do to the Soviets? It takes the value of a gold ingot down tenfold in 2 years, meaning their cash reserves were just wiped out by this one move alone. What about oil? Reagan's first meeting with foreign dignitaries of any substance was with the Saudi oil and finance ministers. And he says, boys, he would always call them fellas. He wouldn't call them boys. He goes, fellas, you're going to increase the production of oil and you're going to lower oil prices. Now, and they knew this was not a request. They said, well, you give us, I'll give you some AWACS airplanes, early warning and control airplanes, but you're going to lower the price of oil. And they did. This chopped out the other leg out from under the Soviet Union. So in two separate ways, he had basically collapsed the Soviet economy. But then a CIA agent named Gus Weiss gets an appointment with Reagan, and he says, Mr. President, the Soviets are stealing our stuff. They're stealing everything. they have a program called Line X, where they will get a permit to come to America and look at tractors, but there's a loophole that allows them to go off and look at fiber optics or glassware or computers. And Reagan said, well, we should close that. And he says, no, Mr. President, we need to open it further. He said, what we need to do is let them steal the technology. He says, well, I don't think I understand. And he says, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to let them steal selected technologies that we have built fatal, catastrophic flaws into the designs. But they aren't going to show up for a year. A year later, Soviet airplanes start falling out of the skies. Submarines start losing their screws at sea. And the biggest one of all, the Trans-Siberian Pipeline, blew up in an explosion called the largest non-nuclear explosion in world history. It took away hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars from oil revenue they got. And the best part, they didn't know which of their stolen stuff was good and which was bad. So they had to yank it all down and reverse engineer everything till they figured it out. It was a crusher. Reagan built alliances with Pope John Paul II to fight on a spiritual level. He asked for release of the Siberian Seven, for example, Pentecostals who were holed up in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, one of whom was going on hunger strike. And Reagan said to the Soviets, he said, look, if you will let these 7 people go, I won't mention it, we won't crow about it, we're not going to tout it, it'll be like it never happened, but they will be free. And sure enough, they were let go free. So he's fighting a spiritual war here. He fights a cultural war, as I showed in my 2010 movie, Rock on the Wall. He increases the funding for Radio Free Europe and Voice of America, which was being beamed behind the Iron Curtain with tremendous effect. It was so powerful, the Soviets tried to stop rock and roll by setting up, ready for this, a ministry of rock. They set up a bureau to handle rock and roll music. And you know what you get with that? The Jonas Brothers, right? I mean, it's horrible. And we interviewed people from behind the Iron Curtain at this time who were just telling us how much rock impacted them, even when they couldn't understand the lyrics. Because you see, rock and roll, country, blues, and jazz are distinctly American pieces of music that start together as a group. They end together as a group. But in the middle, you always have the solo. And this musical structure came across as a music of freedom, even when people couldn't understand the lyrics. In 1988, the East Germans make a critical mistake. They invite in Bruce Springsteen to give a concert because they know he's a big lid. And they think he's going to say all these nasty things about Reagan. And Springsteen plays a couple of songs and he goes, I'm not here to praise or blame any political system, I'm just here to play music. And oh, he is screwed up, this is terrible. So then he starts playing his hit song, which is Born in the USA. Now, some of us know that this is an anti-war song, but if you didn't read the lyrics, you wouldn't know that because nobody can understand a word Springsteen says. I mean, it's all kind of say, what? Born in the USA. So that's what they're getting. So here's 80,000 communist youths, to quote my cousin Vinny, up there going, born in the US, and the commissar, that'd be really screwed up. He makes alliances with people behind the Soviet Union, such as Lech Walesa, to undermine the Soviet system and foment revolt. No other American president would do that. Eisenhower sat on his hands when the Hungarian revolt took place. Nixon sat on his hands when the Czech revolt was taking place. But here's Reagan going, you go, guys, I'll help you out. Oh, I just lost my mind. There we go. You go, guys, I will help you out. He forms an alliance with Texas Congressman Charlie Wilson to send weapons, especially Stinger missiles eventually, to the Afghan freedom fighters, the Mujahideen. And by the way, Charlie Wilson, this is a handsome guy, right? I mean, he's one of the few people who looks more handsome in real life than the actor who plays him in the movie, who's Tom Hanks, right? I'd much rather look like this guy. So anyway, with Wilson, what they do, because the weapons have to look like they're Soviet weapons. They can't look like we're supplying the Afghans with our weapons. So we go to the Israelis. who have the biggest cache of Soviet weapons ever. The Israelis, in turn, we pay for it with American dollars. They ship it to the Saudis, who take the Star of David off the side and stamp the crescent on the side, right? The Saudis then match the amount. So if we send them 10,000 rifles, it's now 20,000, and they ship it off to the Pakistanis, who towed it over the mountain, who deliver it to the Mujahideen to kill Russians. What a great country. You know, is this wonderful or what? Of course, his largest alliance was with Margaret Thatcher, the only woman other than Nancy allowed to call Reagan her Ronnie, okay? And they do have serious disagreements over the Falklands and over Grenada, but nevertheless, she proves to be his most long-lasting ally. But the backbreaker comes in 1983. When Reagan gives a speech on national defense and he saves back a large portion of it, doesn't show it to Nancy, doesn't show it to George Shultz, doesn't show it to almost anybody, and it deals with the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, which the media promptly calls Star Wars. Okay, now this requires some explanation. Back in my day, if you wanted to ridicule something as being crazy, out there, just wacky, you would call it Buck Rogers. Oh, that's so Buck Rogers. And you see he's flying around out there in outer space without any mask at all, just breathing the good space air, right? And here's another one I like down here. This is a great weapon. This is your best alien killing weapon out there. It's a Swiss Army knife of alien killers, because after you kill the alien, you can use it to unplug your toilet too. It's just a wonderful, wonderful device. It turns out, by calling this Star Wars, the media did the biggest favor Reagan ever got as president. Because since Buck Rogers, Americans had seen Americans walk on the moon, walk in space. We had put up several shuttles. We used lasers. And almost everybody had seen or knew about Star Wars, right? And so anybody who's seen Star Wars knew that the evil emperor was a Soviet dictator. Look, say God. I think he auditioned for the part. That meant Reagan was Luke. Because even though he's not young, he has that sunny, optimistic, yeah, we can defeat the Death Star kind of approach to life. And then that meant that Gorbachev, or Gorby as I like to call him, was Darth. Now, we always think of Darth with a helmet, but look at the bottom picture there. Put some glasses on him, he looks just like Gorby. He's even got that little red spot on his head. And I can tell you, when the Cold War was in bloom, we knew where the Soviets were going next, because that little red spot on Gorby's head would take on the map shape of whatever country they were invading. Look, he's going into Afghanistan! And I can prove this, because when the Cold War went away, that little red spot on Gorby's head nearly disappeared, but it started coming back when Putin went into Georgia and Crimea. Look, they're on the Crimea again, watch his head, watch his head. So Star Wars was a tremendous favor to Reagan, and it really was the backbreaker. One thing I discovered in the book in 1988 when Reagan goes to Moscow, he has a dual purpose. First of all, he's going to preach capitalism and freedom to Russians. And he makes this famous speech at Moscow State University. It's hard today imagining Trump giving a speech to any university outside of maybe Hillsdale or Liberty College where he would get a standing ovation, right? Reagan goes in and gets a standing ovation from young communist youths, okay? And he's speaking in front of a giant bust of Lenin, and when Reagan starts his speech, he looks up at the bust and he goes, huh. And then he starts his speech. He said when he finished the speech, gets his standing ovation, he said, I looked at the statue and I could swear it was crying. But the other thing Reagan tried to do when he went to Moscow, he was trying to convert Mikhail Gorbachev to Christianity. And he says to Gorbachev after they talk a little bit, he goes, Mikhail, how are things with God? How are things with your soul? And Gorby is flustered, and he said, well, I was baptized as a child, but of course I'm a communist and an atheist. And Reagan begins witnessing to him on a regular basis. And every place Reagan goes in Russia in 1988, one of his first things, he starts talking about God. God, 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 God. Or if you're a Pentecostal, God, Jesus, okay? And these are the first times that the word God had been heard in the Soviet Union in 60 years in public. It really was amazing. Reagan was asked one time to come out and shoot a picture for in his riding gear. So he comes out in English jodhpurs and the English riding saddle. And the cameraman was horrified. He goes, photographer, no, man, we need the cowboy. And okay. Reagan goes back in, changes into Levi's cowboy hat, flannel shirt. But this is how he often liked to ride. He had no problem riding like this. Riding was one of his great pleasures. So in 1994, he's diagnosed with Alzheimer's. The first time he's really shows any serious mental decline is in about 1992, which blows O'Reilly's book, Killing Reagan, completely out of the water. He doesn't start showing mental decline in the presidency. He's given a test every year at the Mayo Clinic. They found nothing wrong until 1992. I'm still waiting on O'Reilly's next book, which is Killing O'Reilly. But anyway, so Reagan is diagnosed with Alzheimer's. He puts out this incredibly poignant letter to the American public. He continues to ride with his Secret Service agents. And by the way, when he rode, he often would jump fences. The Secret Service had to do whatever he did. So these poor Secret Service guys had to jump fences with him. And Reagan noticed they were having trouble and goes, fellas, I don't think I'll be jumping anymore. No, thank you. So here he is with Alzheimer's, and he's riding with John Barrasso, a Secret Service agent, and he's having trouble. He's almost thrown from El Alamein. They come in, and Barrasso goes to Nancy. He had real trouble. He shouldn't ride anymore. And she said, well, you need to tell him. So the Secret Service agent has to go in and give Reagan, aside from the Alzheimer's diagnosis, some of the worst news he'd ever had in his life. It says, Mr. President, well, watch the wording here. We had some trouble out there today, didn't we? And Reagan said, no, John, I had some trouble out there. He wouldn't let the blame be shared, right? Barrasso says, Mr. President, I don't think you should ride anymore. And Reagan stands up and puts his hands on Barrasso's shoulders, having just delivered this horrible news. And Reagan says, that's all right, John. It's okay. And Barrasso said, here he was trying to make me feel better when I was giving him the worst news he'd had in years. Of course, when he dies in 2004, one of the most fitting memorials to him is at the Reagan Library, a big section of the Berlin Wall. His funeral starts at the Reagan Library, where they bring people up by buses hour after hour. Over 110,000 people are brought up in a day, which is just the size of a small city. And then his body was flown to Lyon State in the Capitol, and hundreds of thousands of people waited there, including people who knew they would never get a chance to pass the body, right? They wanted to wait anyway. And so Reagan kind of left us feeling the same way he left Barrasso feeling. Like even in his worst moment, it was all about us. And that Americans, having suffered through malaise and having suffered through the horrible 70s, were now coming out of it, and it was morning in America. And now I'd be happy to take your questions. Yes, sir. Did Reagan write his own speeches? No, but he rewrote his own speeches extensively. For example, the tear down this wall line was reinserted no fewer than 3 times. His speechwriters kept taking it out. Too incendiary, he says, no, it stays in. He puts it back in. You read his speeches, you see that he goes over them with a fine-tooth comb. Who else? Yes, sir.
How did the assassination attempt?
The assassination attempt, he was, it's ironic, Hinckley unloaded 6 shots. Only the last one hit Reagan, and the only reason it hit him was because the Secret Service agent was doing his job and pushing him into the car, because the last one bounced off the open door of the car into Reagan. And at first, Jerry Parr didn't think Reagan was hit. He said, you okay? He says, well, my chest hurts. I think you broke a rib by falling on me. He says, okay, to the White House. But then he notices Reagan was having trouble breathing, and he noticed some blood, and he said, to George Washington University Hospital. So they get there, typical Reagan, he gets to the hospital, he won't allow them to wheelchair him in or, any assistant. He shakes everybody up, he walks in, the minute he gets on the other side of the door out of public eye, he collapses. So they throw him on a gurney, they take him back to the ER. Many people in the ER didn't know who it was, and they say, what's the patient's address? They go, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. We got the president. Physically, it took him longer than I think most Americans realize to recover. By December of '81, he was still having to keep limited hours because of his stamina. But mentally, there's no indication that, as O'Reilly said, it affected his mental health. Who else? Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Thank you for being so incredibly informative and entertaining.
Oh, I'm always that way. I'm humble, too. I have the humility of the Pope.
Well, modesty in your family, right? I'd like to know, I heard that the Gorbachev summit was a disaster for the State Department folks and all the foreign advisors. But Reagan did a masterful job of that. Would you talk about that?
So he's asking about the Reykjavik summit, which was originally seen as a disaster. Kind of like some of Trump's summits. The first words, oh, this was terrible, oh, the U.S. really lost in this, and all of a sudden you find out actually we won everything we wanted. What's interesting in the papers is you find George Shultz, who doesn't go in being a fan of Reagan, right? But he comes to really admire Reagan, and Shultz would continually say in later negotiations, oh, Mr. President, you won this back at Reykjavik, or you got this for us back at Reykjavik. In other words, over time, Reykjavik was a tremendous success for us. But, you get to Geneva, and Gorbachev had a public relations stunt where he says, let's cut all nukes by 50%. And Reagan wants to eliminate all nukes anyway, so he says, great, why don't we just get rid of all of them? Let's do 100%. And Gorbachev was kind of flabbergasted. He really didn't want to cut that many nukes. So he said, well, you got to throw in SDI. Reagan says, no, SDI is not on the table. And Gorbachev wouldn't give in. And in one point, Reagan looks up at Shultz and goes, George, am I wrong on this? And Shultz goes, no, Mr. President, you're right. He says, let's go, George. And he packs up his briefcase and walks out. And Gorby's like chasing after him. Wait. And he says, what else could I have done? And Reagan kind of was angry. He turned around and goes, you could have said yes. And he gets in the car and drives away. And after that really broke Gorby, because after that he starts coming along on the INF treaty and then on almost every other treaty.
What would you point to as some of the thinkers that influenced Ronald Reagan's own thinking?
Well, Reagan would like to say, I didn't get my economics from Art Laffer or anybody in the 1970s. He would say, I did have a degree from Eureka College, and it was in economics. And he would cite people like Ibn Khaldun and Samuelson, and then later he would cite Milton Friedman and others. When George Gilder came out with Wealth and Poverty, Reagan gave a copy of that to every member of his cabinet. He goes, you guys need to get this. This is where we're going, okay? But he also was influenced by a lot of National Review writers, and they helped him tremendously in the transition. By the way, the transition for Reagan is held up as the best presidential transition ever. Harvard Business School did a case study on it. It was that good. Heritage had outlined every single major issue, and Reagan had his team go over it, put their own stamp on it, and get 300 of his top appointees all vetted and confirmed by March. Trump is still waiting on many of his original appointees 2 years later. By the way, there is an appendix in the book. Reagan and Trump, the similarities, they are very similar. Each was the oldest man to assume the presidency when he came into the presidency. Each was divorced. Each had adult children in the White House. Each had a significant career, most of their career outside of politics. Each was hated by the media. Each was a card-carrying union member, the only two American presidents to do so. So there's a lot of similarities. There's a few differences. There's a lot of similarities.
Reagan didn't tweet.
No, that's a good point. Reagan didn't tweet. Look, here's the thing. If you were alive in 1863-64, you would hear Abraham Lincoln, who was a great stump speaker. But he had a very high, screechy voice. I don't know if you know this about it, but my friends, 20 years ago, you know. It would not fly on radio. So in the 1930s, you have Franklin D. Roosevelt, who has this very honey voice, and is the perfect radio voice. My friends, and you are my friends. You know, it's that kind of a thing. But Roosevelt would not work in the age of television because he was in a wheelchair, and there was still a great stigma associated with that in the 1980s. Reagan is the perfect television president because he can memorize scripts like that. He has a photographic memory. He doesn't have to look at the teleprompter. Being an actor, he understands pacing, right? And why else? The three media outlets had to give you unrestricted time as president. So anytime you want to make an address to the American people, ABC, CBS, CNN, you know, Clinton News Network, and all but Clinton and Clinton Network. Anyway, all those networks, they had to give him time. And it was more or less unfettered time. They didn't have 2 hours of somebody debunking him before he talked, then 2 more hours of somebody debunking him after he talked. So he was perfect for the television era. Would he work in Twitter? No. Reagan is too nice a guy. We have left the era of Muhammad Ali in the boxing match, which was Reagan, and we have entered the UFC cage match. And you've got to get in there and beat the other guy to a pulp. If you've got to kick him in private parts, well, so be it. Right? Whatever it takes to win. Because politics is different today than it was in Reagan's era. I don't think he'd be successful today.
I don't have a question, but a comment. I think you'll enjoy this, and certainly the others will.
Speak up, Dean. Louder and higher.
I was at a fundraiser where he spoke. This is back in California in 78 or 79, something like that. I was in a room of easily 500 people. Okay? You'll believe this. I don't know if the rest of you will. I swear to God, he was speaking to me.
Yep.
Okay? And I bet you everybody else in the room felt the same way.
That's right.
I don't know how the hell he did it.
Now, that's a great communicator. That's what a communicator does, you know, is that they make everybody think that, you know, you're talking right to them. I would ask you to do two things. Buy a book, which is always good for me. It just came out yesterday, so you've got them hot off the presses. Buy any two of the big books that we have back there. I'll give you a copy of 48 Liberal Lies or 7 Events free. But the other thing I'd like you to do, if you don't buy a book, at least get a bookmark and email me at larry@wildworldofhistory.com, and I'll send you a free Reagan webinar. There's all sorts of free stuff on there, so larry@wildworldofhistory.com. All right, thank you.
Thanks for coming. Please, by all means, get a book, get them to sign the book, and mark your calendars for July 10th. It's our next luncheon. Chris Ann Hall will be doing a number of events. July 10th, though, we'll be right back here for an event with Chris Ann Hall. So mark your calendars for that. And again, thanks for coming. Have a great day.